breaking-ish. I'm going over the January 6th committee report. I'm in Appendix 2. If you're new to my channel, please like and subscribe, and let's get started. A couple of housekeeping matters. I have a dog, a big dog, who's being naughty today. He hasn't eaten any breakfast, and he is not listening to me. So I'm not really sure what is going on with our co-host today. You might see him, you might not. So with that said, let's get going on today's episode. As I informed you in the last episode, the National Guard leadership was hamstrung for more than one reason. One of the reasons was Donald Trump's erratic and seditious behavior, and it made the military leadership walk on broken glass for months. And while I understand the acute pressure and stress, my question is, isn't that what the military is designed to withstand? And if not, maybe the insurrection is a wake-up call. The January 6th committee reads, was Secretary McCarthy concerned that President Trump might use the military to cling to power? There was a lot of talk in the lead up about martial law and the employment of forces. And that was something we were all, conscious of. Our investigation suggests that those civilian military officials who had considerable experience working directly with President Trump had genuine concerns about whether he would attempt to use the military to change the election results. Again, at this time, there is no evidence the Department of Defense understood exactly what Trump and his associates planned for January 6th. That's all well and good, but isn't that what our intelligence is supposed to gather? Above the tactical level, changes in the mission of the Guard had to be approved by the Secretary of the Army, and in some cases, in order to interact physically with protesters or be issued batons, required running further up the chain to the Secretary of Defense. You notice how at no point do they talk about the chain of command going up to Donald Trump, because it was delegated by executive order of President Nixon that it would be the Secretary of Defense who would be in charge of the DC National Guard. To district officials, that seemed new and unnecessary. The Secretary told us, if you send them to any kind of mission, that has to get approval from me. And I just think that those were unnecessary restrictions, Chief Conti said. Yes, they were unnecessary. What the QRF force would be called upon to do, even in the case of an emergency, is a matter of debate. The DC National Guard official put in charge of the QRF for January 6th and 5th, Lieutenant Colonel David Renke, said that he had not been given any guidance as to their role. The Army and the DC Guard appear to have had different understandings. The intent of the Quick Reaction Force was really to send these troops over to help if they had a problem on one of the traffic command posts, General McConville said. There never was an intent for a Quick Reaction Force to go to the Capitol. According to Army officials, without a CONOP and a formal change in mission, the QRF would do traffic control and no more. That was not how others imagined an emergency unit would or should operate. According to Major General Walker, a Quick Reaction Force, something's happening. I have time to find you and call you and ask you? He called the pre-approval language highly unusual, particularly as their name already implied that it's a last resort. Their intended purpose was if unexpectedly you have a spontaneous unrest, and if I need to write a concept of operations for a quick reaction force, they're no longer quick. It's just a reaction force. So here you have the commander on the ground talking about how nonsensical the idea of contemplating what the quick reaction force would do be. It's futile to think that because it's evident in the name that it was a last resort, and the restrictions on the quick reaction force didn't make sense to the commanders on the ground. The information gathered by the January 6th committee reportedly demonstrates how various law enforcement departments dropped the ball repeatedly when it came to readiness and planning ahead for January 6th. This is Mayor Bowser's alarm. It wasn't clear to everyone involved in planning for the events anticipated on January 6th that all agencies, including the Capitol Police, were deploying all their resources ahead of the day. We had issues understanding, getting the full picture of the Capitol Police's operational posture and what their planning was, Director Rodriguez said. Mayor Bowser was struck when, right before the press briefing that Monday, January 4th, the mayor asked the Capitol Police representative, "Where does your perimeter start?" And he gets up out of the room, calls somebody, and the next thing I know, he can't participate in the conference. She elaborated, that should have been like a trigger to me. Like, these people, they don't want to answer questions about their preparation. So you understand how frustrated Mayor Bowser was when he was asking questions about the guard and the guard would not answer her questions. On the morning of January 3rd, Chief Sund approached two members of the Capitol Police Board and purportedly requested guard resources for the Capitol, but did not push for it. According to Chief Sund, in a minutes-long meeting in the office of House Sergeant of Arms Paul Irving, Irving told Chief Sund he did not like the optics of asking the guard in advance and that intelligence did not support it. Chief Sund said he did not push on either point. In fact, he agreed that his reading of the intelligence, despite a forewarning put out by his own intelligence unit that Congress was itself the target on January 6th, did not call for guard support, only that having more personnel on his perimeter would make him more comfortable. Irving suggested he talked to Senate Sergeant of Arms and then Chairman of Capitol Police Board, Michael Stenger. According to Irving, Stenger, in a meeting in his office, asked Chief Sund to reach out to the guard and find out if an emergency called for it. How many people can the commanding general give us, and how quickly can he give us those people? Chief Sund said he took their responses to mean no, despite conceding that he was never told you cannot have the National Guard or anything to that effect. It was 100% a denial, he maintained. So while people were giving assurances to Mayor Bowser that all hands were on deck, telling Zoe Lofgren of the Senate, of the Capitol Police Board, and other members of Congress who were reviewing the posture of security forces, that they had all hands on deck. And on January 3rd, they still didn't have any hands on deck. So, and Jack Smith needs to subpoena House Sergeant of Arms Paul Irving, because his intelligence and Chief Stephen Sund's intelligence were rotten to the core. It makes you wonder where they were getting their intelligence from, because they didn't know what was going on until they literally looked up out of their window and saw the insurrection happening. Failure to consolidate and process intelligence about domestic terrorism on January 6th led to security failures that resulted in hundreds of injured police officers and a full-blown insurrection. Several police officers died because of it. Irvin recalled the matter coming up on a three-way phone conference during which the consensus was that we didn't need the Guard. It was a combination of operationally, the chief did not feel that they would add much to his plan, and the intelligence really didn't speak for anything that we felt would justify the need for them. Irving said. Irving was wrong. According to Irving, the conversation ended the same way Chief Sundin said it had. Why don't you just tell them to be on standby? Stenger suggested, and it was never brought up again. What a shambolic performance by these people. I mean, every single excerpt I read about their incompetence is equally, if not more, infuriating. And, congressional leaders were not privy to security planning ahead of January 6th. While the committee writes that this is normal, perhaps after the insurrection they will implement another, procedure for it. The commander of the National Guard's Quick Reaction Force was provided little guidance to the contours of the mission. He took it upon himself to train the Quick Reaction Force for civil disobedience and as civil disturbance. As I mentioned in the previous episode, we would touch up on how there was a disjunct between the top leadership and the on-the-ground leadership of the National Guard. The Quick Reaction Force was most prepared for responding to sudden and escalating civil unrest. At the Joint Base Andrews, they were provisioned with full riot control kits, including a helmet with a face shield already attached, protective vests, skin guards, knee guards, shield, and baton. The head of the QRF himself provided little guidance on the contours of his mission. Had his squad trained for civil disturbance on January 5th and the morning of January 6th as they waited. Not only had they trained, but they trained together as a unit, a benefit military officials all agreed is ideal. Army leadership, all the way up to Secretary McCarthy, had no idea that Lieutenant Colonel Rinke had taken these initiatives. On the ground, commanders were preparing their troops for civil disturbance and took the necessary steps. I think a local unit commander was anticipating more than what potentially we were prepared for, Secretary McCarthy said. But Army leadership did not know that. Well, their top-down leadership analysis and planning fell apart in epic fashion. Colonel Hunter had his troops move the civil disturbance gear, including the prohibited batons, into the individual vehicles themselves. Captain Tarp, the head of the second unit, agreed that they were told to load equipment into the vehicles on the down low. Done so, it wasn't visible, so it wouldn't look like we were escalating our role. The commanding general of the DC Guard was aware that the troops had all they needed in their trunks, but the military leadership did not know that. The only thing I authorized General Walker to do was their ballistic helmets and body armor in the vehicle, not their shields or their ride batons. He figured his orders had been followed. This is General Walker. This is Secretary McCarthy saying. When asked why he was not aware of the moves the Guard had made, Secretary McCarthy said, I made a mistake. I think a local unit commander was anticipating more than what potentially we were prepared for. You think? DC Guard leadership understood the loading of this equipment flouted direct orders. I wasn't going to have my soldiers unprepared, Major General Walker said. The prohibition on batons in particular had been sent 54 minutes after the Guard had already begun their traffic control shifts on the morning of January 5th. So they were trying to hamstring the troops on the ground. Secretary McCarthy, Secretary of War, was trying to hamstring the troops on the ground. He needs to be subpoenaed by the DOJ in their investigation of what went wrong. The DOJ and the military have a responsibility to investigate these failures. You would think that the commanders of the DC National Guard would have the unity of mind when it came to the Guard's core mission. You would think that they would prepare in the face of unprecedented threats and agree on their core mission, and they didn't. Outside the QRF, which had recently returned from 2 days of training together, there is debate as to how ready the rest of the Guard was to engage in civil disturbance response on January 6th. The notion that the military is not primed or naturally skilled to deal with civil disturbance appears to stand in tension with National Guard traditions, training, and doctrine. They were not mission tasked or organized, equipped to do civil disturbance operations, General Flynn said. Oh, here we have Mr. Flynn, who is the brother of Mike Flynn. Although General Piat conceded that all soldiers are trained in civil disturbance, you think. He maintained that on that day, we were not postured to do civil disturbance operations. Major General Walker, who pointed out that the DC Guard shield on the troops' uniform features the Capitol building itself. Protect the Capitol. That's why Thomas Jefferson created it. Called the civil disturbance foundational to what they do. So Major General Walker had the mission of the National Guard at heart. But Secretary of War McCarthy kept on hamstringing, who after the fact came out and said he made a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It was a failure. It was leadership failure, and it was because of indecision and confusion at the top levels of the military. And despite that, on the ground, commanders were ready to deploy and assist local law enforcement in containing the insurrection. House Sergeant of Arms notified Speaker Pelosi about requesting National Guard on January 6th. Speaker Pelosi's response, absolutely go. Let me read that again. The Speaker's Chief of Staff immediately scribbled down a note and went over to inform the Speaker, who was in the chair presiding over the floor debate in Arizona objections, about requests for the National Guard. The Speaker said, absolutely, go. Later, as we were evacuating the floor to an undisclosed location, the Speaker asked her, is the National Guard coming? The Speaker's Chief of Staff said, yes, we asked them. So this notion that Speaker Pelosi somehow got in the way of the National Guard coming to the Capitol, like many in MAGA and many of Donald's allies have said repeatedly over and over again, is false. It's not only false because Speaker Pelosi herself said what she said about the National Guard, but because this evidence gathered by the January 6th committee corroborates what Speaker Pelosi said with what her Chief of Staff said. And the committee reports that Speaker Pelosi said absolutely go, and then asked whether the National Guard was coming. So I'll stop here today because, there's a lot of information and some of the information is fairly repetitive. I don't want to sound repetitive, but I want to drill in how many different ways categorically the DC National Guard's leadership, top leadership, not just failed, but they hamstrung the commanders on the ground. So much so that the commanders on the ground prepared in a hush-hush manner for civil disturbance, and they packed the civil disturbance gear while hiding it. And in 2020 hindsight, we have Secretary of War McCarthy conceding that he made a mistake. He didn't make a mistake. It was a failure. He was wrong repeatedly. So with that, I'm going to close today's talk. Hi, Derek. Thank you for being here. Yeah, it needs to be addressed. The DOJ and the Department of Defense need to investigate Secretary of War McCarthy. They need to investigate House Sergeant of Arms Irving. And they need to report to the public what their finding was. Because clearly, the Secretary of War was not doing their job. Hey, Deb. Hey, Sylvia. Uh, New question. How much do you think? See, here is another. Going to Sylvia's question, I always hold myself back from speculating about these things. The involvement of Mike Flynn in Donald Trump's seditious conspiracy is without a doubt. I'm not going to clump in Mike Flynn's brother with that. The January 6th report doesn't really say anything explicitly where, uh, Flynn's brother, who is currently in the military, had any role in hamstringing, because he wasn't part of the direct chain of command. Uh, but I can't say that Flynn didn't have some influence on the Secretary of War, because he was a general in the military. So when they are talking about it, when they're sharing information, the perspective of other generals would fly in the room. And whether McCarthy and Paul Irving heeded that advice specifically or not, therefore putting this responsibility on the shoulders of General Flynn, not Mike Flynn, but his brother, would be, I think, somewhat irresponsible and would wade into speculative and conspiracy theory territory. So my statement would be that the question of whether Mike Flynn participated in Donald Trump's seditious conspiracy and insurrection, yes, it's clear. Whether his brother did, that is not clear, and there is no evidence in the January 6th report to show that. January 6th report overtly talks about the failures of Paul Irving, the House Sergeant of Arms, and Secretary of War McCarthy. And I want to, hone in on them because they hamstrung DC Guard, despite the fact that on the ground commanders believed and trained for civil disturbance, and they had the correct understanding of the National Guard and the purpose of the National Guard to be citizen soldiers and to defend the Capitol, as Thomas Jefferson had said. You understand, this historical reference is important. It is important in the sense of the on the ground commander was aware of their core mission, historical core mission, and immediate core mission. But the bureaucrats who were, in the decision making chairs were worried about optics. They were worried. They weren't convinced that there was enough intelligence coming in until the insurrection literally stood in front of their faces and they saw it from their office windows. And that's how much of a failure they are. And I don't have any sympathy for Chief Sund or General Milley either, because they are supposed to have the wherewithal to know what was going on. But it was their subordinates on the ground and other commanders who were more aware of it. We saw that Mayor Bowser was more aware of it, and that the Guard was stonewalling Mayor Bowser. We have learned that the speaker's people were lied to. Mayor Bowser's people were lied to about the preparation of the National Guard. We learned that Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren was lied to about having all hands on deck. These were lies. These weren't mistakes. These were lies. because Chief Son didn't have all hands on deck when he told Zoe Lofgren that he had all hands on deck. He didn't even know what the posture of the National Guard was at that time. Paul Irving and Secretary of War McCarthy, they lied about the intelligence not being credible and sufficient enough. There was more evidence coming in about one single event happening on one day with one purpose that we have seen from the January 6th report that would overwhelm any assertion that there was no credible threats of what was going to happen on that day. They lied to Mayor Bowser about deploying National Guard forces. So they categorically and repeatedly lied. And where is the accountability for that? Where is the accountability for National Guard leadership failing to do their jobs on and before January 6th? That is the question. Okay? So, any other questions? I don't see any. You're welcome, Sylvia. I will do my best to answer whatever questions I can. And so, with that, I'd like to say thank you. And I'll come back again tomorrow to continue National Guard leadership failures.